Good morning to everybody, and it is good to see you. And what a great discussion we had last time. And so today we're going to follow that up with a very important and provocative topic: freedom and determinism. Are we free? Are we autonomous, or are we just cogs in a machine, like everything else that we know about in the universe? And if we're not, what exactly makes us special? Why are we exceptions from the laws of nature? That's an interesting question. So let's get started. So, free will, what we refer to philosophically as free will, is the capacity of an agent to choose between different possible courses of action unimpeded, right? So, I am free to choose or not choose in a variety of circumstances. I can make free choices, autonomous choices. Those are my own choices. And free will is, of course, closely linked to the concepts of moral responsibility, praise, blame, legal culpability, and in a theological context, sin. And in fact, much of theology as we understand it, particularly in the Abrahamic faith, much of that it falls apart completely without free will. And so it's a big deal. This is maybe one of the biggest questions in terms of, you know, the consequences of this question are tremendous. And it's a really good question to talk about. Now, it seems or appears that all people have an innate sense that they control their actions and that their choices are not determined in any way other than conscious deliberation. That's our intuition, right? That is our intuition. And in fact, I think a lot of this debate stems from this basic, very compelling intuition that we make choices free from external constraints. But is this true? One thing that we know, you know, I mean, from looking at all of these questions, that sometimes our intuitions are way off base. Sometimes our intuitions are just lousy. And so maybe, our intuition about freedom is an illusion. And in fact, we are just machines. And whatever is going on in this interior space, the internal observer, our subjective consciousness, maybe that is just in reality epiphenomenal. And all the important decisions are being made, at an unconscious level. And that's a disturbing thought for many people. You mean I'm just a puppet in a mechanistic universe? No. This is a case where people just adamantly, right, dig in their heels and say, no, I experience myself as a free agent. I make choices in the world. I matter. I make a difference. I know this. That's the way that I experience reality. But again, what makes that true? You know, just because we believe in something very strongly doesn't necessarily make that true. And so this may be another case where we hate an idea, but that idea is likely the way it is. Now, I'm going to start off with a terrible story. Of course, it's what I do. And we've talked about people who are going to sacrifice their children. We talked about dog murderers. Today, we're going to talk about uh, a 40-year-old father with no, and an actual case. It's a simplified version of an actual case, at least. So we have a 40-year-old man with no prior criminal history, and he was arrested after making sexual advances towards his underage stepdaughter. And this, of course, is completely reprehensible, also very triggering. Again, we think about protecting children and the status that children have in all human societies, and there's just really nothing worse than a person that harms a child. I think we've all agreed on that. And in fact, this man was just incapable of controlling his sexual impulses. Now, this was unusual for this man. He had lived, 40 years and had not experienced anything like this at all. He was just a normal guy. But he was arrested and he was convicted and he went to jail. But while he was in jail, he started to complain about very intense headaches, and doctors discovered that he had an egg-sized brain tumor on his right frontal lobe. And that is an area of the brain that is associated with sexual desire and impulse control. Now, when surgeons removed the tumor, all of the sexually lewd behavior stopped completely. And so this brings up the question, right? And this is very similar to the story that we talked about Simon, the dog killer, when he suffered the head trauma. He stopped, he had no memory of what he had done before, and he had no inclination to harm animals. So should this guy be punished? And this brings up, concepts of punishment and retribution, and again, I'd mentioned the concept of mens rea in the criminal law. We know that what makes an act criminal is the criminal intention, the mental state, that one has at the moment that one commits a crime. So this is an interesting situation. And of course, our entire criminal system and our justice system is predicated on the idea that we are autonomous moral agents that can control our behavior. But what if that's not the case? Yeah, what if that's not the case? Have any of you heard of the case of Phineas Gage? Now, Phineas Gage was a railway worker, and he had a terrible job. As they were building those railroads, most of you probably know that they had to use explosives to blow away the rock to, tunnel across the Sierra Nevadas. And Phineas Gage was a railway worker. And he was in charge of the explosives, and they would, tap down the explosives into the rock with a a giant steel rod. And as he was doing this, the explosive charge detonated, and it sent that steel rod right through his head. And here's a drawing of his skull, right? I mean, he survived, but here's in looking at the skull, someone had traced the path of this iron rod, and you could see that, like, boom, and it destroyed a great portion of his frontal lobe. And again, the frontal lobe has a lot to do with self-control, a lot to do with our desires, our impulses, our personality. And the reported effects on Phineas's personality were drastic. The remainder of his life, he became a completely different person. The people that his family, the people that knew him, said he was just not the same guy. And again, if it turns out that our personality, our very personality, the person that we are, the kind of values that we have, our actions, if these things are not under our control, in what sense does it make to claim that we are free, that we are autonomous? So, I mean, another way to think about this is that we all share the experience of freedom, and it seems like we could do whatever we want to do. But let me ask the question in another way. Are we free to, are we free to change what we desire? we may be free to act on our desires, but are we free to change what we desire? And I'm often reminded, a few years ago, we had this debate when we were talking about same-sex marriage. And the claim was often made that same-sex sexual attraction was a choice. And that to me just seemed like a pretty dubious claim. When I think of my own sexual orientation and the structure of my desires, I don't have a whole lot of control over that, and I doubt that anyone else does. Now, I have control over what I do, perhaps, but I don't seem to have control over what I desire. And if I can't change, that fundamental nature that I have in any way, in any meaningful way, in what sense am I really free? And this is an interesting question, and we need to see if they're going to be answers. Well, before we get to the various theories, let's just ask a more fundamental question, and it's a question I think all of you guys are familiar with. Why did the chicken cross the road? Does anybody know? Because it wanted to. Yeah, to get to the other side. Both of those answers are right, of course, but what do they actually mean? And so this is an interesting question. It's actually a much more interesting question than it seems. Jennifer says, I'm old enough to know the answer to that. Well, why did the chicken cross the road? And let's cash out, Tiana, what you said and what Jennifer said. What are those? What does that actually mean? Well, it depends on who you ask, right? If you ask a molecular geneticist, they might tell you that the chicken could have a mutation on one of its genes at the molecular level that made it move to the other side of the road. If you ask a biologist, they might tell you about environmental epigenetic modifications to the chicken's DNA that led to subtle changes in the road crossing chicken's phenotype. An evolutionary behaviorist might say that the chicken saw an appealing mate on the other side of the road and crossed the street in order to breed, as it is prone to crossing the street whenever it sees an opportunity to mate as an inherited trait from its parents. A behavioral psychologist could argue that maybe when the chicken was a baby, it used to cross the street very often together with its mother, so that when it grew older, it learned the behavior for itself. A neuroscientist might join the discussion to say that maybe the chicken got scared and its fight or flight instinct triggered, causing it to run to the other side of the road, thus crossing the street while doing so. And we could go on and on and on and on and on. And the fun thing here is that all of these explanations are commensurable with each other. They could all happen simultaneously. So it actually turns out that why did the chicken cross the road is an enormously complicated question, isn't it? But I know what you're thinking. You're much more complicated than a chicken, right? Humans make real choices about their lives, maybe in the way that chickens don't. Does that make this problem easier to solve or harder to solve? All right. So here we have it, determinism versus indeterminism. Determinism is the view that all events, including human choices and human actions, all events are ultimately determined by external causes. We are a cog in the machine. The universe is a machine. It's all mechanism. It's all mechanistic. It's all material. Causation works in the universe. It works on us. Indeterminism is the view that at least some events in the universe have no deterministic cause, but occur randomly or by chance. Now, you've had enough philosophy to see where this argument is going. And from this, we get the determinist dilemma. So either determinism or indeterminism is true. If determinism is true, then we're not free because all of our choices are determined by external factors. But if indeterminism is true, then also we are not free. Why? Because if our choices are completely random, we have no control over them. So either way, we are not free. Freedom is an illusion. Now, our challenge is to see if we can maneuver out of this dilemma and find some way to preserve substantive human freedom, like meaningful human freedom, that I make meaningful choices. Now, what are the theories of determinism? And here, this is just pretty basic and simplified, but obviously, human nature. People are born with genetic characteristics that cause behavior, right? Genetics play a huge role, and epigenetic factors play a huge role in biological phenotypes and behavioral phenotypes, right? Environmental factors. And, there's not a hard and fast distinction between genetic factors, epigenetic factors, and environment. Okay, so this is like a sliding scale. It's very hard to distinguish, heredity and environment. These things go hand in hand, but the environment, developmental influences in our environment shape our character. Now, this is a great photo. Does anyone recognize this photo? Alan, that is not surprising. Have you had psychology, Alan? If you've had psychology, you've seen this photo. Do you know what's going on here? This is from the Harlow study in the 1950s. Yeah, Brissa, it's from the Harlow study in the 1950s. And this was a study with infant rhesus monkeys. And these monkeys were provided with surrogate mothers. And you see a picture of one. They're kind of just mock-ups. of an adult rhesus mother, and one of the surrogates was made of chicken wire, like just chicken wire and a face. And if the monkeys went to that surrogate, they could get food and water. But there was another surrogate that gave no food or water, but it was covered in soft fur. And so the infant monkeys actually preferred the non-feeding, fur-covered mother. Why? Because they could cling onto it. I know, Tiana, this is, now that you mention it, this does sound terrible. They preferred the mother that was more comforting, even to food and water. Now, here's the interesting thing about the study. Groups of monkeys were segregated, right? And monkeys that did not have access to the fur-covered mother had huge developmental problems, depression, anxiety, social incompetence. Some of them starved themselves to death eventually, or they became very abusive parents. And so this study demonstrates, and it's a pretty solid study, this study demonstrates the importance of when we talk about emotional support and investigating forms of emotional attachment, this connection with a caring mother or a comforting mother or parental figure, right? How important that is in our social development, right? And so, yeah, environment plays a huge role in the type of person that we become. Psychology, our behavior is governed by psychological forces, most of which we don't perceive or we're not even aware of, right? And then, of course, society. We are social creatures. Like Aristotle said, we're social animals and we are greatly influenced by the people around us, right? We function in hierarchies. We need other people for cooperative projects. We need other people, because other people are integral to our own sense of personal well-being and happiness. So yeah, we're social creatures. So we put all of these factors together. It doesn't make a lot of room for individual choice, right? Or doesn't seem to leave much room for human autonomy. So when we think about philosophical theories associated with determinism, well, we can simply ask the question: are human choices determined? Now, if you say that human choices are not determined, you are a philosophical libertarian. If you say that human choices are not determined by factors beyond our control, you are a libertarian. Or I guess more correctly, that human choices are not all determined, right? You are a libertarian. Now, please don't conflate this with political libertarianism. We'll talk about that. And that's a different view. But philosophical libertarianism says that we make our own choices. We have freedom. We are not determined. Now, what if you say, yes, human choices are determined? Okay. Well, then we have to distinguish between two different philosophical approaches. Both agree, both agree that choices are determined. But hard determinism says there is no room for freedom. End of story. We are machines and nothing else. There's also a view, though, called compatibilism, and this says that human freedom is compatible with determinism. As long as our choices are motivated by interior psychological factors, then we can say that our choices are our own. Our choices are free. So we have compatibilism, it's also called soft determinism. We have hard determinism, and we have libertarianism. Now, I'm going to make a couple more distinctions in this lecture, but here are the basic three. We are completely free. We are not free at all. Or as we are free as long as our choices are determined by interior psychological factors, internal psychological factors. Now, I'm going to make, in the course of this lecture, I'm going to make some more distinctions, but they're just icing on the cake. Really, these are the three positions you should know. Okay, hard determinism, yeah, we're just machines, no freedom. Soft determinism or compatibilism, yes, we're determined, but our choices are still free. Theological determinism, our choices are determined by God, but from our perspective, we're free agents. Indeterminism, random crap just happens in the universe that we have no control over. Libertarianism, our choices are free, they're not determined. And then, excitedly, existentialism, which, like David S. Pumpkins, is its own thing, man. Okay? All right, let's go through this list. Hard determinism. This is the metal of philosophy. This is straight up metal. This is the death metal. Okay? There is no freedom. End of story. Everything that happens in the universe, the physical and biological universe, display well-defined causal connections. Humans are just part of a large causal chain. We're part of a physical and biological universe that is governed by law. So it's reasonable to assume there's nothing special about us. The same physical law that governs every other type of phenomena governs us. All human actions are causally determined. This eliminates the possibility of choice. There's no room for it. Like, how would it, in a mechanistic universe, how would choice arise? Doesn't make any sense. All things have causes. Human choices have causes. Those causes are determined. So all events and human actions are brought about by previous events in accordance with universal causal laws. Human freedom is an illusion. We are not an exception. End of story. Human freedom is an illusion. It's all mechanistic. It's all a machine. Now, the 18th century uh, German philosopher Baron de Holbach broke it down like this, and here's his argument for hard determinism. Human beings are material things. We're physical things. So this is a materialist position, okay? But as far as we know, we're made of matter. The brain is made of matter, right? All changes in material things are determined by immutable laws, scientific laws, or laws that can be described scientifically. All changes made by humans are determined by immutable laws. We're not an exception. To be free, an action must be independent of determining physical causes. No human action is independent of determining physical causes. Therefore, no action is free. Now, this assumes materialism, physicalism, that all things that exist are either matter or energy, and there is no transcendental or supernatural reality. And of course, we can posit that there is a supernatural world or supernatural agency, and maybe that's what makes us free. But again, what do we know? If you posit that, you're going to have to explain it. And we know that's a difficult thing to do, right? How exactly does that work? I mean, you could say, we could be dualist and we could say, well, I have a soul and that's what makes me free. Well, explain to me then how that actually works. And there's nothing, right? We know that. Now, why do we think we're free? Very simple explanation. The complexity of the sources of our actions make it impossible to say why we behave as we do. Let's go back to the chicken. Why did the chicken cross the road? Okay, we could stay here for 4 or 5 hours and not exhaust the relevant physiological descriptions of what's happening in the chicken. That is a suite of causation that is so complex as to make causation opaque. And so our inability to identify specific causes of our actions encourages the illusion that there's something called free will, and this thing called free will is making things happen. But there's nothing in there that's called free will. There's just a machine, right? And yes, the machine is enormously complicated. And it's not easy to point to any specific chain of causation. But just because we can't do that doesn't mean that the implication that our choices are free is even plausible, right? So there's an illusion of free will. Uh, the 18th century mathematician, the French mathematician Pierre Simon Laplace, he said, look, imagine an intellect that could know the position of every particle in the universe. That intellect would be able to predict the future with absolute accuracy because the universe is just a vast machine. Now, we're going to talk about a theory called quantum indeterminacy that makes this assertion wrong, but you get where Laplace is going with this. The universe is just a complex machine, and if you know how all the parts of the machine are working, you can predict what the machine is going to do in the future. So that's hardcore determinism. Hard determinism. What about compatibilism? What about soft determinism? How does that work? Remember, here, the soft determinist says yes, or the compatibilist says yes, our choices are caused, but we still can be free. So compatibilism says all events, including human actions, are caused. However, we can consider human actions free if they are the result of internal psychological motivations rather than external influences or constraints. So I might not be aware of everything that's going on in my head. But as long as the chain of causation that leads me to make a decision has its origins in my psychology, I can say my choice is my own, right? So I'm not aware of all the complex psychological factors that contribute to my decisions. I'm not. There's stuff going on in my head. It's really complicated. People go to therapy because of this, right? And you talk to your therapist, and your therapist tries to identify why you're doing what you're doing. That can be very helpful, right? But as long as the causal chain of factors is limited to what happens in my brain rather than my environment, I can legitimately say my decisions are my own. I can say that my choices are free. Now, this is a pretty limited sense of freedom, right? Also, it puts a kind of firewall between external chains of causation and internal chains of causation that I think is just unrealistic. So does this help us get out of our hard determinist problem? I don't know. Uh, you know, I don't know. What about theological determinism? Okay, here's a theological view, and I'm throwing it in because you may hear about it, right? Everything that happens is predetermined by God. God is a supernatural entity. God knows everything. God is omniscient. God is omnipotent, all powerful. So it makes sense that everything that happens, God is aware of, and really, God is controlling. Okay. So even though acts are predetermined by God, there's still a sense in which we are free. Well, how does that make sense? Because our decisions are up to us. God may know what decision we're going to make because God can see everything. God is like Laplace's demon, right? God knows all the factors, and so God understands what's going to happen. And in a way, right, like Augustine said, God kind of exists outside of time. So God can see the whole chain of causation. So God knows what's going to happen. But we are the ones that make the choices. So freedom refers to being able to do what one chooses to do, even if God knows what we're going to choose beforehand. Now, the problem here, it seems to me that if God really does know what we're going to do before we do it, how is our choice legitimately free? And that's an interesting question. Indeterminism. Some events, including human actions, are not necessarily determined by previous events in accordance with universal causal law. Some things just happen. Some things are entirely random. Now, again, as the hard determinist dilemma points out, this is not the same as freedom. Randomness is not the same as freedom because we have no control over randomness. It may be the case that random things do happen, but that's not freedom. That's chaos. And there are some very smart people like Schrodinger and Einstein who said that God does not play dice with the universe. Although, as we're going to see, it very much seems like God does play dice with the universe. We'll have to look at that. Finally, there's libertarianism. Philosophical libertarianism, not political libertarianism. Humans are able to make authentically free choices that are not determined by previous events in accordance with causal laws. End of story. We are free. It is meaningful to say that we could have chosen other than we did. We could have chosen something different. Look, I had I had oatmeal this morning for breakfast. Could I have chosen something else? Yes. I could have freely chosen something else in a meaningful sense. I did not have to have the oatmeal. Now, a famous version of this libertarian thought comes from Robert Chisholm, and Chisholm talks about agent causation. And Chisholm says, well, when we talk about causation, we have to clarify exactly what we're talking about. Are we talking about just events in nature? Because events in nature are caused, like two billiard balls colliding together. But if we're talking about agent causation, if we're talking about a person can start a new causal chain, like without any contributing causation. We're agents in the world. We act. And so we can initiate a new causal chain on our own, not as a random event, but as a free intentional act. You, as a rational being, can initiate a chain of events without being determined by prior physical or psychological causes. Unfortunately, Chisholm doesn't really explain how that happens, right? Which is a problem with libertarianism in general. Okay, how do we do that? Now, the common experience of deliberation assumes that our choices are undetermined, right? When we think about making a choice, I mean, we all have this experience. We think about the alternatives and we weigh the cost and the benefit. And it does seem like that whole process, we are making a free choice, right? It seems intuitively and immediately evident that many of our actions are up to us. So we could choose different things. Like I could choose to eat the grapefruit. I could choose to eat the oatmeal, right? I'm free to choose between those two things. And the implications here are clear. Moral responsibility makes no sense unless this is true. Think about it. How can I blame you for something that was out of your control? So we can go back to thinking about the criminal law and mens rea. In the criminal law, there is a provision for people who do not have control or do not understand the nature of what they are doing. And we call that the insanity defense. If a person legitimately doesn't understand what they're doing, we cannot hold them accountable for their actions. And so, our idea of retribution, our idea of justice, our idea of moral responsibility all rest on this more fundamental idea that we are free moral agents, that we can make choices, right? Problem is this is never explained. The libertarian argument for freedom of choice often appears to be circular. It relies on the idea that people have free will simply because they can choose, effectively using the conclusion we have free will as the premise to support itself. That doesn't work. Let me give you an example. Can you explain to me what freedom to choose actually means? Libertarian. It means my choices are free. But what does that mean? It means my choices are not constrained. But what does that mean? It means I could have chosen otherwise. But what does that mean? It means my choices are free. Yeah, Alan, what's going on here is just a circular argument. You're just repeating the same proposition in a different way over and over again. What we need is an explanation of how humans make choices. And within that explanation, how those choices are undetermined and completely under the control of our agency. And we don't see that ever. Maybe we're back to dualism. Yay, back to dualism. Maybe events in the brain lead to the performance of actions that do not have an entirely physical explanation. That could be true. That could be true. It is possible that some non-physical mind or soul overrides physical causality. That could be true. But what's the problem with that? How does that happen? There's no explanation. So while it is a possibility, if no one has come forward with an explanation of how this actually happens, should we even take it seriously? That's a problem. All right, let's play a little game. We're going to meet four people: Theophilus, Rocky, Calvin, and Hobbes, and you're going to tell me if they are a hard determinist, a theological predeterminist, a compatibilist, or libertarian. So, hard determinist, theological predeterminist, compatibilist, or libertarian. Theophilus believes that actions we take are determined by psychological facts about us. For example, our attitudes, our likes, our dislikes, our past experiences. Nevertheless, if we had different desires and attitudes, we could have chosen to do something other than what we did. Thus, in a way, our choices are free and we do have free will. So our choices are determined by psychological factors, but we can legitimately say that there are choices. What is Theophilus? Yeah, he's a compatibilist. So here, determinism and free will are compatible as long as what's motivating us is some internal psychological factor, like a belief, a desire, a past experience, etc. Very good. Rocky believes that our present decisions are not determined by the events in our past, but they are not random either. They are caused directly by human agency. And it's the human agent that has a radical form of freedom and responsibility. What is Rocky? Wow, that was quick. Rocky is a libertarian. Our choices are free. End of story. How about this? Calvin believes that everything has been created by God, who fully knew and foresaw the actions of moral agents from the beginning. He believes that you cannot avoid your destiny, be it heaven or hell, since all of your choices have been foreseen by God. Nevertheless, you have moral responsibility since your actions are, after all, your actions and no one else's. What is Calvin? What is Calvin? Calvin is a predeterminist. No, Nicole, not a hard determinist. He's a predeterminist, right? Because he believes our choices are free, but they have been foreseen by God, assuming some form of consistent mechanistic causation is going on, because how else would God know, right? So this is, and why did I throw this in here? I threw this in because predeterminism is an interesting theological view that you should be familiar with. Okay. Yes, Nicole, foreseen but not controlled. Does that make sense? I don't know. Maybe, yeah. Hobbes believes that everything happens according to the dictates of the physical laws of nature, including his own decisions. We have the illusion of freedom, but actually we are just the slaves of the atoms in our brain. This is easy. Hard determinism. Yeah, this is hardcore determinism. We're just cogs in the machine. There's nothing special about us. This is hardcore, right? This is the heavy metal of determinism. This is Scandinavian death metal of determinism. There is just nothing. There's no freedom at all. Okay, evidence from neuroscience. This is very interesting. There are studies by Benjamin Libet that were able to detect brain activity related to a decision to move a finger, right? These are real fascinating studies. And the scientists were able to detect brain activity and could detect which finger was going to move before the person that was moving the finger knew it. And let me repeat that so you guys understand it. So here you have somebody in a lab, and the scientists say, okay, move one of your fingers. And the scientists have hooked up the brain, and they're looking at probably an MRI of the brain or something. And the scientists know which finger is going to move before you do. So at least some actions, like moving a finger, are initiated unconsciously and then enter consciousness afterwards. This is compatible with that idea we all hated, epiphenomenalism. Remember that? Yeah, Tiana hated that. Think about I don't know if you guys play an instrument or playing the piano or something or drive. Like think about driving your car. Like when I drove my car here again I tell the same story all the time because it's true all the time. I don't remember driving the car. I just do it reflexively. So how am I in charge of that again? I guess this view would be compatible with soft determinism, right? Because everything that's going on is internal. So they are my choices in a way. All right. That's pretty interesting. Alan says when I was walking on my own, I was always thinking about how my brain just controlled my movement, but I was not always aware of it. Yeah, most of the stuff we do, we're not aware of. Like we're not aware that we're metabolizing. We're not usually aware that we're breathing, right? Like Alyssa said, yeah, so much is beyond conscious control, right? Okay, here's a big one, and we have to talk about it because it will come up, and I'll try to do my best. I am not a physicist. I am not a physicist, but I'll try to do my best here. Quantum indeterminacy. Do some things just happen in the universe at the quantum level? Answer, it seems that the answer to that is yes. Some things happen randomly. Uh, and so determinism might not be all it's cracked up to be. Okay. Um, we have to talk about something called quantum superposition. Okay. And we'll get to Schrodinger's cat. The Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, and this is a major, probably the dominant interpretation of what all of this means, holds that a physical system exists in all possible states simultaneously. And that's a crazy thought. It's a kind of a crazy thought that there's more than one physical state. But if you think of all the possibilities when we think about an electron, like where is an electron? If you think about all of the possible places an electron could be, that electron kind of exists in all of those places simultaneously until something acts on it. And then what happens is what physicists call a wave function collapse, and it becomes a single definite state. And we can actually say, oh, there it is. So an electron, for example, exists in all of its theoretically possible states simultaneously until it's measured or observed. Okay, this is the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Now, that's a monkey wrench thrown into determinism, isn't it? Because things are impossible. Things just happen randomly. Things are impossible to predict. That's craziness. This gives rise to quantum indeterminacy. And so when we talk about the position of electron that has not been acted upon in any way, we can only describe that in terms of a probability distribution of outcomes. So some physicists talk about the electron existing in a probability cloud, where it is in all of these different positions simultaneously. So the behavior, like what should we take from this? The behavior of the quantum world, according to the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, is inherently random and probabilistic. It's not deterministic. Okay, it's not. Not everybody is happy with this. And the reason is, I mean, think about it. None of us experience the world in this way at the macro scale, at the scale that we live in. Like, we don't experience the world in terms of quantum superposition. It just doesn't make any sense. So large objects are governed by classical mechanics, not quantum mechanics. So things don't just pop in and out of existence randomly, right? And so this brings us to Schrodinger's cat. Now, Schrodinger was a German physicist who, like Einstein, did not like the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics at all. Did not like this. Schrodinger was a determinist. So was Einstein. Einstein famously said, God does not play dice with the universe. That's not an affirmation of God's existence, by the way. It's just that the universe doesn't, the universe is deterministic. Things just don't happen randomly, like the Copenhagen interpretation suggests, right? So here's Schrodinger's cat. This is the actual cat. No, I'm just, it's not. Right? So you put a cat into a box. And by the way, okay, what's the point of this example? The point of this example, and no one seems to understand this, that is not a physicist. The point of this example is to show that the Copenhagen interpretation must be wrong. Okay? That the universe is deterministic. So here's Schrodinger, and he says, look, he wants to say, well, not necessarily that the Copenhagen interpretation is outright wrong, but it's incomplete. So he believed in determinism. Okay, so you have a cat and a Geiger counter and a radioactive substance, along with a hammer and a vial of poison, are placed in a sealed steel chamber, a box. Put the poor cat in a box. Now, the radioactive substance has a 50% chance of decaying within a given time frame. Okay. If the substance decays, the Geiger counter detects it, triggering the hammer to break the poison vial, killing the cat. If the substance does not decay, the cat remains alive. Now, here's the kicker, and we all know this from the Copenhagen interpretation. There is no way to know if that radioactive substance has decayed or not. There's no way to know that because it hasn't decayed or not. It's in superposition. Which means that the cat is also in superposition, that the cat is both alive and dead simultaneously. Now, Schrodinger says this makes no sense because until the box is opened and observed, the cat is in superposition, meaning it is considered to be both alive and dead at the same time. This is absurd. This never happens in our world. We never experience anything like this. Therefore, there must be something wrong with the Copenhagen interpretation. Now, how do we get out of this? There are physicists. Again, I'm not a physicist, okay? But there are three main theories here, and they're all kind of crazy in a way. One, the Copenhagen interpretation is right. Things just happen without cause. That's just the way that the universe works. It's not mechanistic at the quantum level. It's not deterministic. Or two, this is really crazy, but many physicists believe this. The many worlds hypothesis. The universe branches into many worlds, parallel realities for every possible outcome. What? Or the decoherence view, when a quantum system interacts with the environment, it loses its quantum coherence and behaves like a classical object. Okay, so these are the three ways to get out of the problem. Okay, now let's look at the most extreme libertarian position, which is existentialism. And this brings us to Sartre. And students love this stuff. And I love this stuff. It's great. I don't know if it makes any sense, but it's wonderful stuff. And so Sartre argues for a radical freedom, but not in the conventional philosophical way. Sartre, although he did write philosophical treatises, Sartre was a French philosopher, a modern French philosopher, somebody who had fought in the French resistance during World War II, was very prominent in continental thinking after World War II. Almost everyone is familiar with existentialism to a certain degree. Sartre argued that humans are radically free. That in fact, it is our freedom that defines us. And man, this taps into almost every romantic notion that we have. I mean, this is catnip to people. It is. They love it. And so very famously, Sartre says, man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. And again, he did write philosophical treatises, but he was more famous for writing plays in which these ideas could be developed and thought about. And so this idea of radical freedom, that we make ourselves what we are, and we choose to be what we are, is a very powerful idea. Very powerful. One of the most powerful ideas in history. The idea that we have the freedom and the power to determine what we are. And Sartre says this power is complete. That only we can determine what we are. Now, does Sartre, is he completely unaware that there are external constraints? No. Yes, of course, there are external constraints on us, and there are limitations to what we can do. Sartre says these don't matter at all. That no matter what your situation, no matter how precarious it is, no matter how constrained you are, ultimately it is your responsibility to determine what you are. And you cannot escape that responsibility. And that is the only responsibility that you have as a human being, is to determine what you are and to choose what you are, to make yourself what you are. Think of a chair. Chair is the thing that exists in the world. It has no control over what it is. That's because it has an essence. What is the essence of a chair? Well, what is a chair? Somebody tell me what a chair is. Not a hard question. What is a chair? What makes a chair a chair?
An object with a seat on it that you can sit on it. Usually
Yeah.
with like
Yeah. Right. Yeah, something that you can sit on. Malika says that, yeah, you can sit on it. It probably has legs. It may have a back. There are a lot of different configurations, but there is some set of essential characteristics that a chair must have to be a chair. And we determine what that is. And a chair is a chair and only a chair. It can never become something else. Now, here's the thing. An essence is a predefined ideal set of characteristics. Here's the great thing about being human. Human beings do not have an essence. There is no definition that constrains us. There is no essential predetermined nature that shapes what we are and what we can be. Therefore, it is up to us to determine what we are. And that is the essence of freedom. That is what freedom means. The choice to determine what we are. How do we determine what we are? The choices that we make. This gives rise to a very radical sense of freedom. We choose what we will make ourselves to be. We are entirely responsible for our own existence. We are entirely responsible for the meaning of our life. Even in the face of external events beyond our control. Will things happen that are out of our control? Yes. That does not matter. Why? We have ultimate control over what our life means. Now, Sartre does not believe in God. But even think about it this way, even a person who does believe in God and divine providence must at some point choose to believe that. And this is what Sartre is talking about. I define myself by the choices I make. I define the meaning of my life by the choices that I make. And only I can do that, and I must do that. I cannot avoid taking responsibility for the meaning of my life. I can't change the circumstances of my life. I can't change the fact that I can't fly. I can't change the fact that I can't spin silken webs out of my butt. I have no control over that. I cannot change maybe my social station or where I was born or what I look like. But I still have total control over what all of that means. And I have a responsibility to determine what that means. Even a man on death row who is walking up the scaffold as they put a rope around his neck, he has a choice to make about the meaning of what is happening. He can accept it. He can shake his fist in defiance. He could try to rebel. He could try to escape. But he must make that choice. And if you want to talk about the limitation on freedom, wow, walking up the scaffold and having the rope put around your neck, that is not, that is being very constrained by external forces of the world. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. Why? Because ultimately you choose what it means. Even things that have happened in our past are up to us. even your past is up to you. Now, that doesn't seem to make any sense, does it? Like, Professor, what has happened in the past is gone, is dead. It's happened already. Sartre says, no. You give meaning to those events now. A man who is sent to prison for a theft must choose whether that time was useful or injurious. You determine that. You were in prison for 10 years. What did those 10 years mean? That is your choice to make. And you cannot escape that choice. You're the only one that can give meaning to that period of time. And you're the only one who can understand it. And you have a responsibility to make that choice. So Sartre refers to this as living a life and choosing your own meaning and choosing your own destiny as authenticity. How many of you have heard this phrase, authenticity? Comes right from Sartre. Are you guys familiar with this?
Yes.
Yes. It's a phrase that has taken on its own life within, the discipline of psychology and therapy, and kind of, a lot of people who are online, but I mean, it goes to, like, directly back to this idea from Sartre, who says authenticity is the acceptance of our radical freedom. And embracing our responsibility for determining the meaning in our life. Who we are is up to us. We are not predetermined like an object. We are not predetermined like a chicken. We're the ones that give meaning to why we cross the road. Why did I cross the road? I must determine that, and I must give a sense of purpose to that, and I am responsible for doing that. And I can't blame anyone else for it. I can't shift the responsibility. I can't say, well, it's in God's hands, or I can't say that I had to do it. I must take responsibility for what I am. Now, is freedom a good thing? Well, maybe it is, but I think that you can already see that this degree of freedom can be a burden. Because we look for ways to escape the burden. We pretend we are not free. We pretend like, the things that are going on are outside of our control. And when this happens, we get this sense of anguish. Our responsibility is a blessing and a curse. It leads us to feel anguish, despair, even. That I alone am responsible for the meaning of my life. Why can't I put that responsibility on someone else? Why can't I pretend like I'm determined? Why can't I pretend like it all had to happen this way? So the burden of taking complete responsibility for ourselves throws us into a state of anguish and despair. And so we make excuses. We try to flee. We try to give up our freedom. And when we give up our freedom, Sartre says we are acting in bad faith. We're pretending that we had to be this way. We're pretending that we're not free. We're pretending that we're not responsible for what we are and what we do. But in fact, we know we are the one who is responsible. I pretend that I'm causally determined, or I see myself as a victim of circumstances. That is bad faith. That is inauthentic. That is a lie. It is a lie that we tell ourselves to avoid taking responsibility for who we are and what our life means. Because in the end, we are the only one who can give meaning to our life. And that is what it means to be human. And that is why we're different than the chicken. Oh, man. Good stuff. We will revisit Sartre and another existentialist named Camus in our last lectures on meaning. And I don't know that existentialism was a productive philosophy in the sense that there weren't a lot of offshoots of existentialism that persisted, but the existentialists are always worth reading, for sure. Particularly Sartre and Camus and de Beauvoir and some people like Nietzsche and identify Nietzsche as an existentialist to a certain degree, but there's this sense of celebration of freedom is a very kind of profound philosophical movement, and we should not discount it, even if Sartre never quite gives us a real working definition of what freedom is, as much as he talks about freedom. And he does give a very convoluted defense of freedom in some of his more philosophical works. But I still kind of look at it askance and go like, well, how does that work exactly again? But you cannot help but get caught up in this rhetoric when you begin to read Sartre, for sure. All right. We have crossed another topic off of our list.